to move forward with the next speaker on our list. Let me check. Next speaker on the queue is Oluwapelumi Mojolaoluwa. I do apologize for pronouncing wrongly the names.
No problem at all. I'm here.
Okay, thank you. I do apologize for if I pronounce your name wrongly.
That's okay.
Welcome on board.
Thank you very much.
Just a moment to find your presentation. Perfect. Okay. So, now Oluwapelumi will present on balancing the competing interests on humanitarian intervention and state sovereignty, lessons from Libya. This presentation explores the intricate tensions between protecting human rights through intervention and while respecting state sovereignty. And all these come as a result drawing key lessons from the 2011 UN intervention in Libya. Oluwapelumi's work delves into the legality, the consequences, and potential frameworks for balancing these competing priorities. So, let us welcome Oluwapelumi to shed light on this complex and important topic. Oluwapelumi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, my name is Oluwapelumi Mojolaoluwa. I'm a Nigerian lawyer and I've just completed my LLM earlier this year. And my thesis was based on balancing the competing interests of humanitarian intervention and state sovereignty, lessons from Libya. So essentially, what I sought to do with the thesis was to look at the concept of humanitarian intervention and then the concept of sovereignty and how those two concepts in international law, how they clashed in the instance of Libya. So the important thing was to draw, the legal implications out, because most times when this matter is discussed, most people look at the socio-economic implications. So I wanted to look at it from a legal point of view, and I wanted to see what lessons we can draw for future interventions. Can I control my slides from here, or would you do that from over there? I think you're okay. Yes. So humanitarian intervention and state sovereignty are seemingly two parallels that have continued to meet from time immemorial, with one eventually superimposing on the other. Muammar Gaddafi's Libya provides a noteworthy example of these competing ideas and how things may play out where one encroaches upon the other. Then I looked at sovereignty, then I looked at how the two of them would clash ordinarily, and then I looked at the questions that have lingered on how necessary the intervention was, the propriety, and then the legality of it, which is what I zeroed in. And then I looked at the intended and unintended consequences. This research interrogates the conflict between humanitarian intervention as well as the intersections of these concepts, especially in international law. It then proposes the canonization of the right of humanitarian intervention to arrest crisis situations like Libya's in the future. The development of more tailored approaches to de-escalating internal conflicts in sovereign states, amongst other recommendations, which policymakers and international actors can leverage to effectively navigate these competing interests in future crises. So, this next slide. So, what I have done is that I've looked at humanitarian intervention as a concept, looked at sovereignty as a concept, then we looked at what happened in Libya, in 2011 and what prompted the United Nations intervention. Clearly, from my research, I saw that humanitarian intervention has a long history. It's not a new concept. It didn't just start in the case of Libya. It's something that dates back to the 19th century. There were interventions in Greece, in Syria, Bosnia. There were authorized and unauthorized missions in Somalia, Bosnia, Rwanda, in East Timor, Kosovo, and then in Libya in 2011. So Libya seems to be the most recent, and that's why it gets more attention than others. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. Hello. Next slide, please. Yes. So balancing the competing interests of these two concepts, is a major challenge in international relations. So in my literature review, what I did was that I looked at the concepts, the positions that people have taken. I looked at the definition of humanitarian intervention. I looked at the definition of sovereignty. I looked at what other scholars have said about it. Then I looked at Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, a real world example of the concept itself. And then I looked at the legality of the concept, is it provided for in the UN Charter? Is it not provided for? Are we really arguing about the existence of this concept or about the necessity and the legality despite the existence? So uh, my main argument was that if we are able to take lessons from what happened in Libya, we can actually achieve a balance between these two concepts. Next slide, please. So humanitarian intervention is the use of force by states to protect civilians from human rights abuses by their own government without that government's consent. So essentially, we're looking at necessity. It is something that happens only in a crisis situation, not just according to the whims and caprices of the United Nations. Then temporary encroachment because of the idea of sovereignty, which means that a state has total control over its own geographical area and the people within it, its own governance. Humanitarian intervention encroaches into another state, and the encroachment is temporary, it's not permanent, which is what happened in Libya. Then it is to protect, that's the focus, is to protect civilians and their human rights. So essentially, how humanitarian intervention is kick-started is when there's a right or a set of human rights that are being abused. Without that, humanitarian intervention cannot.
Your emphasis, especially on post-intervention strategies and the need of a codified framework for humanitarian intervention, highlights actionable pathways for addressing the complexities of any future crisis. Your presentation was excellent. Thank you so much for that. So, let me ask you a question before giving the floor to the audience. So my first question would be, considering the unintended consequences of the Libyan intervention, what do you think would be specific elements that should be included and in a qualified framework to ensure both legitimacy and efficacy in future humanitarian interventions?
Well, if I get your question correctly, you are asking what the United Nations should look at before deciding to intervene. Yes, first, there must be an actual crisis situation, and the crisis situation must be such that there's large-scale human rights abuse by the government of a state. Because if it's not being done by the government can take care of whoever is doing it on their soil. But if it's being done by the government, then the people are helpless. So the United Nations must first ascertain that there's an actual crisis involving large-scale abuse of human rights and that the people are actually helpless. And then they must also ascertain that there's no other means, there's no